Hello and welcome. I'm Katie Brown, Registered Dietitian and Senior Vice President of Sustainable Nutrition at National Dairy Council. We're excited you've joined us for a closer look at the science of whole milk dairy foods within healthy eating patterns. This is the second webinar in our Dairy Nourishes Life webinar series. This quarterly series addresses a range of topics related to dairy's role in health and sustainable food systems to help practitioners like yourselves navigate the evolving health and wellness landscape and to answer any questions you may be fielding on hot topics. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few reminders. For optimal viewing and audio experience today, we recommend that you use Google Chrome or Firefox as your browser. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat window on the left side of the screen and a representative will respond to assist you. You can also feel free to type any questions you have for our presenters into that same chat window. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can in the time allotted for Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you're following this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag Dairy Nourishes Life. This webinar has been approved for continuing education by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, the American College of Sports Medicine, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, the American Academy of Family Physicians as well. You'll receive an email with your CE certificates and copies of today's slides, as well as a survey within 24 hours. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available next week on NDC's website. For those of you not familiar with National Dairy Council, NDC is a nonprofit organization founded in 1915 by dairy farmers because they believe in the science and the importance of understanding how dairy foods may benefit human nutrition and health. Today, NDC represents about 40,000 dairy farm families across the U.S. as well as dairy importers. Again, welcome to the webinar on behalf of America's dairy farmers and the broader dairy community, our diverse team of scientists, registered dietitian nutritionists, and communications professionals who strive to bring to life the dairy community's shared vision of a healthy, happy, sustainable world with science as our foundation. You know, U.S. dairy farmers and the U.S. dairy community believe in a world well-nourished and are committed to providing responsibly produced, nutritious dairy foods that help nourish people, strengthen communities, and foster a sustainable future. And this is even more relevant today than ever before as we're challenged with not only feeding but nourishing an estimated nearly 10 billion people around the globe by 2050 while honoring our planet and natural resources. As health professionals, you're probably keenly aware that we're at an important fusion of personal health and planetary health. And it's critically important to be grounded in the science about nutrition and food systems from the multiple dimensions that make up sustainability, social, economic, and environmental. The body of evidence, innovation, and continuous progress indicates that dairy can be part of the solution when it comes to health and sustainable food systems. Our speakers today are going to shed more light on the science supporting the role of dairy foods in human health. But as we look at that fusion of human and planetary health, I'd be remiss if I didn't showcase the dairy community's commitment to protecting our planet for future generations. And because of farmer and dairy community stewardship, best practices, and efficiencies, a gallon of milk in the U.S. today can be produced using 90% less land, 65% less water, generating 76% less manure and 63% less greenhouse gas compared to about 70 years ago. And this is not our end game. The U.S. dairy community has pledged to continuously improve and has set a voluntary goal to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. You can learn more about this from our last webinar, Dairy's Role in Health and Sustainable Food Systems, which is archived on nationaldairycouncil.org website. But today I'm thrilled to provide more insight on a hot topic many of you have noted from our survey in our last webinar, the science of whole milk dairy foods within healthy eating patterns. Today I'm joined by Dr. Matt Pekoski, Vice President of Nutrition Research at National Dairy Council, and Registered Dietitian Nutritionist Leslie Bonsi, owner of Active Eating Advice by Leslie. Matt and Leslie will provide an overview of the body of evidence on this topic as well as practical tips to help people better understand how to appropriately include a variety of dairy foods across the fat spectrum into healthy lifestyles. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks to everyone on the line for joining us this afternoon. You know, when we were discussing various titles for this portion of the webinar, I must say this one really resonated with me, as I found it particularly fitting given, at least in my opinion, where we are today in terms of our inflexibility or really absoluteness in the desired answers to almost every question posed on a variety of issues. I'm not sure where we became so unaccepting of shades of gray, or really digging deeper to have a dialogue about the nuances of the answer to a particular question. No matter the topic of debate, most folks are usually take the position of it's either yes or no, or you agree with me or you don't, right? Rarely are people able to find some middle ground in the gray. Now, this is particularly complex in science and nutrition, where inevitably the answer to most questions is, well, it depends. As health professionals, I think we need to be careful to not fall into the trap of oversimplifying the science to suit or appease the definitive one-bullet answers desired by most media members and some of the general public. So today, hopefully through our dialogue, we can help to open your minds to being more flexible, open to those shades of gray, and ultimately digging into the nuances to better understand the impact of dietary fat, and primarily dairy fat, on health and disease. Now, as all of you are aware, there's been an evolving discussion on the impact of dietary fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol on health. Here you can see various covers from Time magazines over the years, and the point is not necessarily to talk about the science behind these covers, but it's really just to be an illustrative example of how the dialogue and perceptions have changed on this topic over the years and how that's played out in the lay press. You know, starting in 1961 with Dr. Ansel Keys and his famous 7-country study that really served as some of the underpinnings for recommendations and initial recommendations from the American Heart Association around total fat and saturated fat in the diet. Then really moving to the shifting views on cholesterol, whether it's bad for us, then it's good for us. Questioning whether it's carbohydrate or fat that's really making us fat, and then ending here with the cover in 2014 proclaiming butter is back. Here's a nice slide that lays out the evolution of our current dietary guidance related to fat over the years. While there have been some subtle modifications and adjustments in the range or recommendations for total fat, and then the recommendations specifically to limit trans fats beginning in 2005, where we are today is really not that far off from where recommendations started some 40 years ago, with total fat recommendations within the range of 20 to 35% of total calories, and saturated fat recommendations of less than 10% total calories. Now, much of that original thinking on the impact of saturated fat on risk of heart disease was based on the fact that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, and then in turn, if we've seen that LDL cholesterol raises one's risk for coronary heart disease, therefore it was assumed that there was a direct link between saturated fat and increasing risk of coronary heart disease. Now, more recently, however, the science in this area has evolved, and there's two main points I'd like to mention here. One is that our understanding of lipid metabolism has significantly grown. So while not to dismiss the value of LDL as a biomarker for disease, we now have a number of biomarkers that can be examined to tell a more complete picture. Secondly, instead of being limited to examining the impact of saturated fat on a biomarker of disease, like CHD, we now have data from large prospective cohorts that have tracked healthy subjects for a number of years and looked at those that develop disease to try to better understand the associations between diet or saturated fat and disease risk. Now, over the years, there have been several large meta-analyses and systematic reviews published that have generally concluded that current data do not support an association between saturated fat intake and risk of cardiovascular disease. While I don't have the time to go into each of these systematic reviews specifically, I simply wanted to hear for reference so you could look at those in detail at a later time. Now, the discussion around saturated fat and health, as many of you are aware, should also consider what nutrients are being consumed in place of the saturated fat if you're working with a particular client or patient to have them reduce saturated fat. We know from available science that reducing saturated fat and backfilling with carbohydrate does not necessarily provide any benefit in terms of reducing risk of CVD. However, the science does support a beneficial impact of replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats. or CVD risk. The question I would like to now raise, which will transition us to the primary focus of my talk here today, is that the case for all sources of saturated fat? Now, that next question is important for two primary reasons. The first being, as we know, there's really been an evolution in terms of how we should be conducting and interpreting science to understand the complex physiology underlying the relationship between diet and health. And in turn, how are we translating this into dietary recommendations, and that being from a nutrient-focused approach to a food-focused and ultimately dietary pattern-focused approach. The interplay between individual nutrients in the context of the food matrix and then foods in the context of a dietary pattern do need to be considered when looking at their overall impact on health. And second, while many may think saturated fats are all created equal, that's really just an oversimplification of the complexity of saturated fat overall, and specifically dairy fat. Dairy fat is made up of more than 400 individual types of fatty acids, making it one of the most complex fats naturally occurring in a food. About 65 to 70% of those fatty acids are saturated, with the remaining being unsaturated. Additionally, it's important to note that individual saturated fatty acids in dairy foods have different biological effects, which contribute to this complexity. For example, stearic acid, which is one of the primary saturated fatty acids in milk, has no effect on LDL cholesterol. While the other three primary saturated fatty acids, stearic, palmitic, and oleic, yes, they raise LDL cholesterol, but they also raise levels of HDL and lower triglycerides, which is a pattern associated more with reduced risk for CVD. Now let's take a look at the evidence for the impact or relationship between dairy foods, CVD, and type 2 diabetes. Now, given our limited time here today, I don't have the ability to go through the full body of evidence in detail. However, I would like to refer you to the scientific summaries available for download on nationaldairycouncil.org. These summaries do a great job in providing a more comprehensive review of all of the science regarding the role of dairy foods. And again, when I mention dairy foods here today, I'm focused on milk, cheese, and yogurt and their impact on risk of disease. Overall, the weight of the evidence demonstrates that dairy foods have either a neutral or beneficial association with reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and lower blood pressure in adults. And I do want to emphasize that when I make this statement, it encompasses the data for total dairy, that being the full range of dairy foods from fat-free to whole milk dairy foods. Regarding the research specific to whole milk dairy foods, emerging evidence suggests that they are not associated with an increased risk for CVD or type 2 diabetes. I now plan to highlight a few noteworthy studies and then really spend more time digging deeper as to what it might be about dairy foods or dairy fat specifically that is contributing to these relationships. Here's one of the most recent papers examining the relationship between dairy foods, cardiovascular disease, and mortality, published in 2018. It found that higher consumption of total dairy foods was linked to reduced risk of mortality, non-cardiovascular mortality, CVD mortality, major CVD, and stroke. These relationships were observed when comparing consumption of greater than 2 servings per day to no consumption. Specific to whole milk dairy foods, this paper found higher consumption of whole milk dairy was actually associated with lower total mortality and major CVD. Here's an interesting clinical trial that was published in 2016 that sought to determine whether the benefits of the DASH diet, which many of you know typically contain 3 servings of low-fat and fat-free dairy foods, whether those could be maintained with a simple swap of those for whole milk dairy foods, and again, milk, cheese, and yogurt. To the right, you can see the macronutrient content of the diet, with the increases in both total fat and saturated fat on the whole milk DASH, with the swap to keep calories constant being for dietary carbohydrate. Now, compared to the standard DASH diet, the whole milk dairy DASH resulted in similar benefits of lowering blood pressure, and really the only difference in blood lipid response was actually an added benefit of lowering triglycerides in the whole milk DASH group. The key takeaway here is that whole milk dairy foods can be incorporated into a healthy dietary pattern that is calorie balanced, with able to see improvements in standard biomarkers of heart disease. Shifting gears a bit to highlight some of the evidence related to dairy foods and risk of type 2 diabetes, here are the findings from two large meta-analyses published in 2013. The first on the left found total dairy intake was associated with a 7% reduced risk for type 2 diabetes per additional 400 grams of dairy found in the diet. In subgroup analysis to look at if this relationship was different between type of dairy food and or amount of dairy fat, beneficial associations were also found with low-fat dairy products, low-fat or skim milk, cheese, and yogurt. Similar findings were shown in the study that was published in PLOS One. Total dairy intake was associated with a 6% reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, now at a little bit less per serving, about 200 grams serving added in the daily diet. Beneficial associations were also found with low-fat dairy, cheese, and yogurt. The last point I want to mention regarding whole milk dairy foods specifically is that both of these meta-analyses showed whole milk dairy foods were neutral when it came to type 2 diabetes risk. Now, what does that look like in terms of serving size? Obviously, this depends, as depending on the type of dairy food you select, the serving size is different, but generally speaking, if you have one serving of each of the main products, milk, cheese, and yogurt, that adds up to about 443 total grams. So you could see within the two trials I mentioned, you were seeing these associations with reduced risk potentially somewhere between 1.5 to 3 servings a day. Now, one of the considerations when evaluating nutritional epidemiology is the inherent limitations with self-report dietary intake data, whether that be from food frequency questionnaires or food recalls. Another tool in the scientist's toolbox to examine these associations is the use of validated dietary biomarkers. For dairy fat, there are actually 3 fatty acids that are not made endogenously by the body and primarily derived in the diet from dairy foods, making them a reasonable and validated biomarker for dairy fat consumption. This pooled analysis published in 2018 found that higher circulating levels of these 3 fatty acids were associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Here's a quote from senior author Dr. Darius Mazafarian from a Tufts University press release that highlights his thoughts related to a need to re-examine the guidance that focuses exclusively on low-fat and fat-free dairy foods, given the potential metabolic benefits of dairy fat in whole milk dairy foods demonstrated in this and some other studies. So now, is there something different about dairy fat that's contributing to these effects? In the beginning of my presentation, I already alluded to the complexity of dairy fat specifically, right? That, all saturated fats are not created equal, and we need to think about the individual fatty acids when we're thinking about their relationship to health and/or disease. We also need to think about the dairy food matrix overall, and is that contributing to the findings that we've seen? First off, milk and dairy foods contribute a significant amount of essential nutrients to the diets of both children and adults. Here's NHANES data which shows that even at current consumption, which is only about 1.7 servings a day, dairy foods contribute just over half the total amount of vitamin D and calcium in our diets, along with significant amounts of 6 other essential nutrients. Overall, the science has shown us that consuming dairy foods does improve overall diet quality, and having a higher quality diet certainly may be playing a role in the beneficial associations noted with reduced risk of disease. Here I just put this as a reminder. I don't need to go into the detail, but certainly the complexity of dairy fat overall contributes to the thinking that all sources of saturated fat should not be considered as equivalent with their impact on lipid metabolism or disease risk. There's also some evidence to suggest that the packaging of the fat may matter when looking at the impact of different dairy foods on blood lipids. Now, the fat in dairy foods is typically packaged or encapsulated in a membrane called the milk fat globular membrane. This membrane is rich in bioactive phospholipids and proteins enclosing the milk fat. Now, compared with other dairy products, butter has a relatively low milk fat globular membrane because of the churning process and how it's made. So to examine whether simply the packaging of the fat in dairy foods might play a role on their impact on blood lipids, investigators designed this study to provide subjects either whipping cream or an equivalent amount of butter oil for an 8-week period. Now within these two diets, the macronutrients and calcium were essentially matched. And the only true difference in the diets was the lower milk fat globular membrane content in the supplemented diet in comparison to the whipping cream. Now here you can see really the marked difference in the response of LDL cholesterol, again, between the whipping cream and the butter oil diets. And really, again, that's simply due to the difference in how that fat was packaged and delivered. There's also some data to suggest that cheese may affect blood lipids differently than other foods, and in this instance, butter, that has a similar overall fat profile. Here are the findings from a 2015 systematic review that looked at 5 separate clinical trials that compared equivalent amounts of hard cheese or butter and looked at the impact on blood lipid profile. Now, despite the fact that hard cheese and butter have a similar ratio of saturated and unsaturated fat, you could see that cheese consumption had lower total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and also slightly lower HDL cholesterol compared to equivalent amounts of butter. Now, there may be multiple things kind of underlying this from a mechanistic standpoint. And again, the authors concluded, it's the food matrix that might be different, right? Whether it's the calcium in cheese, the protein in cheese, or other aspects of the cheese that might be causing these different metabolic effects. Now, for the sake of time, I don't really have the ability to go into the detail, but one thing I want to mention specific to these results with cheese and or some promising findings we've seen with yogurts that I don't able to present to you today is that fermented foods overall, and yogurt and cheese being 2 fermented dairy foods, the fermentation process and the potential beneficial bacteria that might be coming along with that could be playing a role in impacting some of these effects. Now let's look to see if there's been any evolving recommendations from different professional bodies that have considered this latest science. Here's a position statement from the Canadian Heart and Stroke Association published in 2015, which did acknowledge kind of the evolutionary nature of the science that we've seen today. 2 important points do seem to align with what we've mentioned. And one, they've acknowledged that emerging science suggests the health effects of saturated fat could vary depending on the food source in which they are found. And secondly, their ultimate recommendations do not include a threshold or upper limit for total saturated fat intake. Rather, they focused on encouraging folks to consume a healthy, balanced dietary pattern, which in turn might ultimately reduce total saturated fat levels in the diet. Here are the updated diabetes guidelines from Joslin Diabetes Center that was published in 2016. And again, there's 2 points to mention specific to dairy that seem to align with the evidence that I've outlined here today. The first is that they modified their previous guidelines, which focused on recommending exclusively low-fat and fat-free dairy products, to now really allow for the flexibility to consume the range of fat levels across dairy products, as long as the patients were able to do that within their personal calorie intake levels or staying within energy balance. They also acknowledge that dairy foods are included on a list of foods that may be associated with reduced risk for developing type 2 diabetes in some studies. Lastly, I just want to point out that going back to 2010 and again in 2015 with the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee reports, this beneficial role of dairy foods in reducing risk of disease has been acknowledged. Also of note is that they do not specify a specific fat level. They talk about dairy foods as a category. Now, we also know that current dietary guidelines call out the valuable role of dairy foods in the context of healthy dietary patterns. They do continue to recommend low-fat and fat-free versions. Now, certainly one reason may be the concern of the issue of calories. And, as a practitioner and from a public health standpoint, I could see where, given the overweight and obesity epidemic in the U.S. and the general fact that both fat-free and whole milk, well, they contain the same 9 essential nutrients, might it be more prudent to stick with the recommending these lower calorie versions in an effort to help control total energy intakes? While that might be the case, I think we should look at the data to see, is there a link or an association, an independent association, I should say, between increasing whole milk dairy foods and weight gain. Here's an interesting study published by Mazafarian and colleagues a few years back that looked at really the relationship between various foods in the diet and their association with change in body weight over different 4-year periods. And what this graph is really showing you is the changes in body weight, either gaining or reducing weight over that 4-year period for each additional serving of that food. Now, specific to dairy foods, you could see that cheese was not associated with any change in body weight. Yogurt, on the other hand, was actually associated with about just under a pound of weight lost in that 4-year period for each additional serving that was provided. And lastly, when it comes to milk, you could see that milk, again, had no real impact on weight change with each increase in serving over that 4-year period, and that was regardless of fat level. This table summarized the findings of a systematic review published by Kratz and colleagues in 2013. At that time, there were 16 observational studies reviewed. 12 of those actually saw an inverse association with the intake of whole foods and risk of obesity, while the others showed a neutral effect. Overall, the authors concluded that the observational evidence does not support the hypotheses that dairy foods or whole milk dairy food consumption would increase risk of obesity, and in fact, it does appear to suggest a potential decreased risk of obesity. Now, ultimately, the dietary guidelines do also talk about, an allowance for flexibility for various nutrient-dense foods that contain small amounts of saturated fat, as long as they stay within current recommendations of less than 10% of total calories. And I think really all we're kind of posing here today for folks to consider is, doesn't the data suggest that the same flexibility could be allowed for dairy foods? In summary, from the scientific perspective, we know that emerging evidence shows that saturated fat in and of itself is not associated with CVD risk. Now, that's not to say we should have kind of feeling that, carte blanche, that we could increase and intake as much saturated fat as we would like in our diets. I think what it does tell us or allow us to do is that, have some flexibility if that saturated fat is coming with nutrient-rich foods. We've also shown that dairy foods have either a neutral or beneficial association with reduced risk for CVD, type 2 diabetes, and low blood pressure. And specific to whole milk dairy foods, we have not seen any data to show an increase in risk. Emerging evidence suggests that the fat in dairy foods may have unique properties that differentiate it from other food sources of saturated fat. And some professional organizations have begun to evolve their recommendations to take into consideration this latest science. All that being said, we do acknowledge that we're under the current guidance from the 2015 dietary guidelines, and we need to adhere to those. So we do still encourage folks to stay less than 10% of total calories from saturated fat. Now, that being said, we also think the data supports that whole milk dairy foods can be a part of healthy eating styles as outlined by the current dietary guidelines. And, at the end of the day, from my perspective, we are not encouraging people that are comfortably already meeting the dietary guidelines by consuming their 3 servings of low-fat and fat-free foods. We're not encouraging a shift to swapping out fat-free milk for whole milk, let's say. But what I think I would want practitioners to consider is that if you're working with an individual who's currently not meeting their 3 servings a day as recommended in the dietary guidelines, and maybe a primary barrier for that individual not meeting their 3 servings is that they simply do not like the taste of, say, the fat-free or the low-fat versions. I think what the data shows is that you can have some flexibility to work with that individual to see if you could keep them within the constraints of energy balance and total saturated fat intake, to have some allowance for, say, a serving of whole milk to help get them towards their 3 servings a day, because I think the benefits in terms of improving the overall nutrient adequacy of the diet will be valuable. And lastly, certainly more research needs to be done to further elucidate and understand these relationships, both in observational data and clinical trials. Thanks for your time and attention, and now I'd like to hand off to Leslie Bonsi, who's going to be talking about this from a more practical perspective.
Well, hi, everybody. Matt, thank you so much. And it is my job as the cleanup batter, so to speak, to talk about how we indeed translate this science to the plate, keeping in mind not just what people eat, but the palatability of the foods that people tend to have each and every day. So just as a reminder for all of us is when we think about dairy foods and reminding our consumers as well, what are the big 3? We're talking cheese, milk, and yogurt. And one of the things to keep in mind, if you look across these 3 foods, is that they are tremendous sources of essential nutrients. Cheese providing 6 of the essential nutrients, milk 9 of the essential nutrients, 3 out of 4 of those which are the nutrients of concern, in other words, the ones that are underconsumed as identified by the dietary guidelines for Americans, particularly calcium, vitamin D, and potassium, and also yogurt, which provides 7 essential nutrients. Now, this is regardless of the milk fat content. The fact of the matter is that these foods are full of benefits in terms of what it is that people need to be having in their diet every single day. The other thing just to point out as we get started here is the ease of these foods. They are ready to go. There is no culinary expertise involved. They are available, they are accessible, and they are affordable. And that is critically important as we're working with people to help them move the needle to optimizing their ability to create healthy eating patterns every single day. So when we think about dairy and this idea of matrix, and let's look specifically at the milk matrix, what is it? What are these 9 essential nutrients and what is their role? Yes, calcium, familiar to all of us, but when we're talking with our clients, consumers, patients, is to help them realize it is not just for building and maintaining bones, but also for the health of their teeth. Yes, protein, critically important to build and repair muscle tissue. It's more than just spending time in the gym. You actually have to do the hand-to-mouth activity as well. Vitamin D has a role to play in terms of building and maintaining strong bones and teeth, and we know there are not a lot of foods that provide us with vitamin D. Niacin, or vitamin B3, is important for the body to be able to glean the benefits out of the foods that we eat each and every day, and the role it plays in energy metabolism. Vitamin A that is found in dairy foods is important for the health of the skin and for the eyes, and also to help to promote growth. Pantothenic acid, or vitamin B5, is also important for its role in helping our body to extract and utilize the energy from carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Cobalamin, or B12, is important for normal blood functioning as well as for the health of our nervous system. Riboflavin, or vitamin B2, again, like pantothenic acid, helps the body to better utilize, absorb, and metabolize carbohydrates, fats, and protein as an energy source. And phosphorus is critically important. It works alongside calcium to build and maintain strong bones and teeth as well as supporting tissue growth. So we know that we're getting a lot of benefit in that glass. Now, in addition to that, when we think about perhaps, what if somebody said, well, I'm not necessarily going to do these 3 servings of milk every day? Okay, so if we take them out, what do we have to replace them with? And I show you this because this is pretty overwhelming to think about all the food that one would have to have if indeed one took out those 3 servings of dairy. You would have to have 4 large hard-boiled eggs, or eggs prepared another way. You would have to have the equivalent of 17 cups of raw kale, and even for those people who love it, that's a lot of kale to consume every day. You would have to add, in addition to that, 3 cups of cooked red kidney beans, 1 pound of pork chop to provide the B vitamin. You would have to have almost a cup of whole almonds. You would have to have 5 cups of chopped broccoli. You would have to add 3 cups of sliced red peppers. You would have to have a 6.5-ounce can of sardines, or approximately 15 of them, and 6 large whole mushrooms. All of those foods will be provided to replace the nutrients that are found in milk. Now, not only is that a tremendous amount of food, but calorically, that could put people right over the top of their calorie cap each and every day. Plus, how would the gut hold all of that? The other thing is that when we think about what those trade-offs are, is that if somebody says, I'm going to not do milk, I'm going to use vegetables, the reality is that the bioavailability of the calcium in vegetable product, we don't know what that issue is. How bioavailable are they? And could that indeed pose a concern when people are trying to do this each and every day? The other thing to be aware of is milk, yogurt, and cheese are what we call foundational foods that are included in multiple eating patterns. You heard Matt talk about the dietary guidelines, but in addition to that, it is DASH. It is the American Heart Association. It is the National Osteoporosis Foundation. And to remind everybody, the last 3 sets of the dietary guidelines for Americans recommend 3 daily servings of dairy for everybody over the age of 9 years. So that being said, how are we doing? Well, report card, not so great. And we know that's not just about dairy, it's about other things too. The reality is that nearly 9 in 10 Americans fall short on dairy recommendations. That's actually the same number of people who fall short on their produce recommendations. And so when we think about that, on average, Americans are consuming less than 2 equivalents of dairy foods daily. Okay, so we have some work to do. And the reality is that adding in 1 more serving a day not only could help to close those shortfall nutrient gaps, but it could also support health benefits. So that's a double-edged sword in a positive direction. And really the thing we want to talk about, because so many times patients or my patients will say, oh, I can't eat this, oh, I shouldn't. It's one more thing to take away. Oh, no, 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 no. Now we're talking about adding. Positivity resonates. So that can be a very, very meaningful way to help people to get to their goals each and every day. The other thing is, and this is a very, very recent survey by the Hartman Group in 2019, is thinking about where people are focused. You know, what do they think about in their eating? Fiber is a big one. Protein is a big one. Vitamin D is a big one. Calcium is a big one. So obviously people are hearing these messages. But at the same time, if you look down towards the very bottom, the third from the bottom, you will see that 21% of consumers say that they are adding or increasing full-fat dairy in their diet. If that's because they're seeing it more on the shelves, if that's because they like the taste of it better, if that's because they're even listening to some of the recommendations out there, the fact of the matter is that it helps when we're talking about that versatility and fat flexibility. So that being said, let's look at this a little bit more. Fat flexibility is the name of the game today. And since everything I say has to rhyme in some way, shape, or form, make your plate great by allocating nutrient-dense foods with saturated fat that help to stay within 10% of the calories per day and also one's calorie cap. So it is fat flexibility, it is dairy versatility, it's the availability, the accessibility, and the affordability. And to the point that Matt mentioned earlier, is, if people are having non-fat dairy and they're happy with that, great, but not everybody is. So we can provide them with an option, but it's not necessarily just an add, it's a swap for. If somebody is going to opt to do full fat, they are doing that in place of something else in order to be able to stay within a healthy eating pattern guidelines each and every day. So if we take a look at all of the milks, this is not new probably to most of you on this call, but I think it's something that bears worth repeating and reiterating when we're talking with our clients. So if we look across the various percent milk fat of milk, skim milk, 1% milk, 2% milk, and whole milk, you will see there's a lot of similarities. In each of these, for an 8-ounce glass, you're getting 8 grams of protein. You're getting 30% of the daily value for calcium, and you're getting 7 other essential nutrients. So the only difference between the various milks is the amount of fat that is in them. In skim milk, it's 0. In 1% milk, it's 2.5 grams per 8-ounce glass. In 2% milk, it's 5 grams per 8-ounce glass. And in whole milk, it's 8 grams for an 8-ounce glass. And the calorie levels tend to be different as well, from 80 calories up to 150 calories a day. So a lot of versatility, and I will tell you, working with athletes, you know what, I have some athletes that actually have to put some weight on, and so it becomes a good way for me to not only get the calories into them, but to get the calories with the oomph behind them. So let's look at that another way. When we think about the milks and we compare them, whole milk or skim milk, again, for an 8-ounce glass, you look at the difference calorically, 150 in an 8-ounce pour of whole milk versus 80 in the skim milk, and the fat content 8 grams versus 0 grams. So basically it's a difference of 70 calories per glass. So if we multiply that by 3, it's 210 calories a day. Could somebody do that in their diet? Well, yes, and maybe then they would making a trade-off to have less of something else. And the other thing about this is that in that glass of milk, we're getting the 9 essential nutrients. We're also getting a source of fluid that is there. We're also getting some carbohydrate that is there. So there are other things that are in there, and the protein as well. It's not just about the fat or the calories per se. So when we talk to our clients about this, the whole idea of set themselves up for fat flexibility. So in order for somebody to stay within their calorie and their saturated fat cap, the S for swap less nutritious sources of fat for fuller fat, nutrient-rich dairy foods, the E to ensure that their snacks stack up, and the T to think about portions, or as I say to my athletes all the time, never eat anything larger than your head. It's a good reference point, and that's what their helmets are. So if we're looking at guiding our clients with a fat flexible approach, what are the questions that we might want to ask? And the first one is, are you having 3 servings of dairy per day? So if the answer is yes, we'd ask the question, are they all reduced fat, low fat, or fat-free? Are you happy with those dairy choices in terms of the taste, in terms of the way that they function in recipes, in terms of the satisfaction or satiety you get from them? And if the answer is yes, keep on doing it. If the answer is no, then maybe we think about where we might be able to make some changes in eating in order to be able to derive more satisfaction and enjoyment from those dairy foods. If somebody says that they are not using all reduced fat, low fat, or fat-free, then are their calories and saturated fat intake within recommended limits? And if they are, bravo, keep on doing what one's doing. And if they're not, then where might we be able to make some changes so that we help people to stay within their guidelines? So if we ask that question, are you having 3 dairy servings a day, and the answer is no, then we might offer up some alternatives, is thinking about the versatility of milk, of yogurt, of cheese, thinking about the ability of those foods to pair with other foods, thinking about the taste, the texture, the mouthfeel, the palatability in order to help people increase their amount of dairy to get to those 3 servings a day. So let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. First off is milk. So if somebody says, all right, maybe I'd like to include some whole milk, and we think about that dairy matrix, but also those that are looking for taste and texture. They can just have it as it is, that nice creamy mouthfeel. Or they can blend with berries or veggies or herbs for smoothies. Or to use in place of cream in a recipe. For every 1 cup of milk, you mix in a tablespoon of flour or 2 teaspoons of cornstarch to make the roux before cooking. In order to temper spicy foods, for those people who say, I love hot, but it doesn't love me, the capsaicin in the spicy foods actually binds to the flat globules, so you get less of that fiery effect in the mouth. We can freeze cubes of whole milk and blend them with coffee or tea for frappes. And, it's approximately an ounce per 2 tablespoons per cube. And then we could splash it into black coffee. Now, if somebody says, well, I'm trying to be a calorie conserver, what could they do? Well, certainly using lower fat or fat-free dairy foods could be a go-to choice. We can lighten up smoothies that way. We can add the creaminess to an oatmeal by cooking it with a low or skimmed milk rather than water. We can use it for a pour on cereal or granola, adding it to a sauce or a soup, or even whipping it to add for the foam for a latte and cappuccino. All right, what about yogurt? If somebody is looking to get the taste and the texture, the whole milk yogurt provides that creamy texture. It is lactose friendly, and it also provides the lactic acid. So we can thin it with a lemon juice or balsamic vinegar to make a salad dressing. We can use it as a dip like a tzatziki or a raita, making this fabulous, flavorful dip for veggies or whole grain pitas. We can blend it with fruit for a smoothie or a snack. We can add a little bit to add a creamy texture to a vegetarian stew, and also it helps to quell that fire with spicy foods. If somebody is a calorie conserver, it makes a beautiful marinade to use a lower-fat yogurt because the lactic acid actually tenderizes the meat, the poultry or fish. It can be used in place of mayo. It can be frozen for a delicious, delectable dessert. It lightens up an Alfredo. I use it a lot as a sour cream replacement for potatoes, for tacos, fajitas, or even into a stroganoff. And if we do the Greek, low fat, we get that thicker texture and protein boost. And then what about cheese? This is my favorite. So for the taste and melt lover, the flavorful cheeses like cheddar and Gouda with sweet and mild fruits like apples, pears, figs, delicious. Or we could shred and sprinkle those hard cheeses on our veggie pizzas, on veggie burgers, on pasta primavera, or even beans and rice. Or sprinkling those flavorful cheeses like blue on spinach and berries. If somebody is a calorie conserver, pairing those cheeses with other healthy fats, like a mozzarella stick with almonds for a go-to snack. A creamy, light quiche with a low-fat Swiss and evaporated skim milk. Even lightening up mac and cheese with a shredded reduced-fat cheddar and also adding some riced cauliflower to that. A pizza with a part skim mozzarella or low-fat provolone and favorite veggies. And then I love this combination of whipping cottage cheese on whole grain bread, adding a little sliced strawberries. Absolutely delicious. So what would fat flexing look like for an absolutely delectable day? For breakfast, we could do an overnight oat with oats, a reduced fat plain Greek yogurt, slivered almonds, strawberries, and banana. For lunch, a portobello mushroom sandwich, the portobello in a whole wheat pocket with 1½ ounces of a cow's milk feta, some hummus, tomato, spinach, and then having an orange on the side. In the afternoon, peanut butter on an apple. Our dinner, a pasta caprese with pasta and zucchini noodles to get the extra veggies in there and keep the calorie cap. Adding some grated tomatoes. Adding 1½ ounces of a bocconcini. Some shrimp and pesto. And then for an evening snack, a popsicle made with skim milk and frozen berries. Very easy to get those dairy foods in. So we know that dairy is so very delicious, nutritious. It's convenient. It is so simple, ready to use. We can use it alone. We can mix it with other foods. It heightens the flavor of the food that we savor. It is enjoyable. There is no waste and fabulous taste. So we want people to choose the dairy foods that they enjoy with that flexibility. And so the idea of this is that we know that dairy foods at all fat levels offer a unique nutrient package. So if somebody might consider reducing less nutrient-rich sources of fat in order to incorporate in a whole-fat dairy food, that helps them to create a healthy eating pattern that is flavorful and enjoyable. So that whole idea of variety, of satiety, of creativity, not just to the plate, but also to the palate. So when we are talking with our clients, let's have them consider the taste, the texture, mouthfeel, palatability, personal preference, as well as the function in recipes or meals. That is how we create a great plate. Everybody, thank you very, very much.
Leslie and Matt, thank you so much. We will take some questions. We have a few minutes left for questions. And as we wrap up, I hope you have a better understanding of the science of whole milk dairy foods within healthy eating patterns. And for more evidence-based materials to ensure you have the latest on dairy's role in health and sustainable food systems, please visit nationaldairycouncil.org. Not only will you find the science summaries that Matt mentioned, we have delicious recipes to help bring some of Leslie's tips to life, as well as a host of other information. What you see on the computer screen on this slide is one of my favorite posts because it shares answers to common questions about dairy from A to Z. Lastly, I invite you to join the Dairy Nourishes Network. As a member of the network, you'll receive a quarterly newsletter from National Dairy Council, as well as other resources, recipes, and opportunities. If you're not already a member of the Dairy Nourishes Network, you can join through the post survey you'll receive soon after this webinar. And with that, I'd like to pose some of the questions we received in the chat box to Matt and Leslie. We'll start with a question to Matt from Penelope. Thanks, Penelope. You were mentioning that there was a slide that Matt showed that indicated no relationship between saturated fat and coronary heart disease. And then another slide showed about reducing saturated fat intake and replacing that with unsaturated fats and reducing risk. And the question is, could you clarify that?
Yes, thanks. Appreciate your question because I do see that there may be some confusion there, and I think it really comes down to a nuance and really the question that you're addressing in the given study, and really there are kind of two separate questions with each of those points you raised. One is, does saturated fat in and of itself serve as a relationship between directly increasing and or potentially decreasing risk of a specific disease, and in this case, coronary heart disease. So that in and of itself is a question, and again, the majority of the data available shows really no, again, independent association. So that means in and of itself is saturated fat associated with disease risk. And again, the latest evidence does not appear to support that. That being said, certainly as nutrition professionals, right, when we're working with a client and we're talking about how do you build diets that contain a number of nutrients, if you're going to be talking about, increasing or decreasing a nutrient, the question then becomes, what are you either, replacing it with and or what are you omitting from that diet? So in the discussion of saturated fat, you also need to consider, how is it playing within the context of a diet. And in that instance, we know that, if you are decreasing saturated fat and you're replacing it with unsaturated fats, there does appear to be a benefit. However, as I mentioned, when that kind of exchange was made for carbohydrate in studies, there does not seem to be a benefit. So again, I think big picture, at least in my personal interpretation and how might I translate that into what it might mean from a practitioner. Again, just because there is not an association with saturated fat and CVD, it doesn't necessarily give us, in my opinion, kind of free rein to eat as much saturated fat as we want, because you need to think about, is the diet overall adequate and balanced? And if we're eating too much saturated fat, are we impacting our energy balance? Are we thereby limiting the intakes of other important nutrients? So all that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think what we've generally shown, again, is that, saturated fat, when it comes along with nutrient-rich foods, we should feel like there's a value in that.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And I think an application question that came through that I'll pose to Leslie, kind of along those same lines. Leslie, question is, are you telling people whole milk is okay? And then kind of a sub of that is, how do I educate my clients on how to include fuller fat dairy foods while keeping an eye on sugar and calorie intake?
Okay, so from what we heard from Matt is based upon the science of what we know and what is emerging, the reasons that in the past we have told people to limit whole milk dairy foods because it increased the risk of certain diseases. Well, indeed, maybe that is not the case. Now, if somebody is comfortable having fat-free dairy and it's what they've been doing, by no means does somebody need to change. However, there are people that may be somewhat hesitant and reluctant to consume dairy because they don't like the low-fat or the non-fat, and this provides another option for them. But realizing that those foods, the whole milk foods and whole milk dairy product, do have a higher calorie cost, then we have that dialogue with them and we counsel them on how they might make some other changes to perhaps limit some calories in some other way. Now, the question posed about dairy and when we are looking at sugar content, let's realize that when we are talking about milk, Lactose is the sugar that is in the milk naturally. Nothing has been added, so something that's very important to differentiate from something that might be an added sugar. And let's also remember that when we are talking about dairy foods, we are talking about a way of providing protein, and not just the protein, but all of the other micronutrients. So thinking about our micros beyond our macros is critically important too, and the hydros in the milk.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and both of you guys talked a little bit about the dairy matrix and the full components of the elements that are in dairy foods, not only the macros and the micros, but the structure itself. Leslie, one more question on that same kind of topic. There's a question that says, isn't fat-soluble vitamin D better absorbed in fuller fat dairy?
Well, one of the things about fat-soluble vitamins is that fat-soluble vitamins need the presence of fat in the diet in order to be absorbed. And so if somebody is having a whole milk or a fuller fat dairy, then yes, you are doing a better job with absorption. On the other hand, if somebody says, okay, that's not something I want to do, then it's also not a diet devoid of fat. It's important to have some fat in the diet because not only for the palatability and the satiety, but the fact that fat is important as a way of helping people to absorb their fat-soluble vitamins.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And speaking of saturated fat and risk for disease, Matt, this question's to you. What's the impact of different animal food sources of saturated fat on risk for heart disease?
Yeah, another great question. And again, I think it's in line with one of the premises or viewpoints we were trying to encourage is really looking at the impact of different dietary patterns or at least foods, whole foods, in their risk of disease. So, there's been, some research in this area, and actually there was just a paper published in Circulation a few weeks back. Key was the first author that looked at consumption or compared the consumption of various animal foods that do contribute saturated fat and their relationship between risk of ischemic heart disease. And what they found essentially was actually higher consumption of red and processed meat was positively associated with risk of ischemic heart disease, so it was associated with increased risk. However, none of the other animal foods examined were positively associated or associated with increased risk. So, and particularly intakes of fatty fish, yogurt, cheese, and eggs were modestly associated with reduced risk for disease. So again, I think, there is data now beginning to come to bear regarding the different impacts of different foods on the relationship to disease. But again, I would suggest you to look for that publication if you want to learn more.
Very good, thank you. There were some questions both on the science side and the application side related to inflammation. Several questions that came through on that. So I'll pose this to both Matt and Leslie. I'll start with you, Matt. What about the inflammatory nature of dairy foods? To what extent is that true? And then again, for Leslie, if you can follow up, the question was about, is dairy pro-inflammatory in the diet?
Yeah, great question, and certainly it's one that's relevant as much of the dialogue today is not just talking about disease, but also talking about as inflammation as being one of the potential underlying causes or mechanisms by which some of these diseases are developing. And contrary to the misperception by some that dairy foods may in fact contribute to inflammation in the diet, again, we always say, let's look at the science, right? So actually, fortunately, there was a systematic review published in, I believe it was 2017, that looked at, all the clinical trials available. I believe there was 52 clinical trials evaluated in this systematic review. And actually, they found no association between dairy food consumption and increasing inflammation. And actually, there were some tendencies for dairy foods to show a decrease in inflammation. So again, I think the science actually supports that dairy foods could be neutral or even beneficial when it comes to inflammation.
And from my perspective, From my perspective, what I would add to that is the things that oftentimes we recommend people to do to decrease inflammation, and I do this with my athletes, is to increase their produce consumption. Well, when 9 and 10 not getting enough, one of the things we can do is all right, if I can put some of those potentially anti-inflammatory fruits and vegetables into a smoothie and it gets it into somebody, then that's a benefit. And dairy, becomes the glue that holds that together, so to speak, whether it is in a smoothie, whether it is a yogurt parfait, whether it is adding a yogurt-based dressing or a dip in order to have somebody increase their vegetables. That's a win-win all the way around.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example. And, the fermented foods as helpful in that inflammatory response as well is really another added benefit. So we are at the top of the hour. Thank you guys so much for joining the webinar. We had outstanding participation. Please look for the post-survey that will come to you very soon with your CE certificate, as well as an opportunity to join the Dairy Nurses Network. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar very soon. Thank you so much.